church benches and into the trenches. Let's make a righteous ruckus.
Hey, welcome to this episode of the Righteous Ruckus podcast. I'm your friendly host, Riley Lowe, and I want to talk today about I'm going to start off with is a few Bible verses talking about mainly the Israelites, how they, even though they witnessed all these miracles, instead of moving forward, they longed for the times before. And I want to talk about some times in my life when I've done that. And, I'm sure everybody watching this or listening to this can relate to this. And then I want to really drop a truth bomb there at the end. So you're going to want to stick around to the end to hear, it won't be a rant, but it's going to be just a really convicting for myself and everybody else. Big old truth bomb that just explodes there at the end. At least that's the way I got it planned. Who knows? Something else may change. So let's get into it. I'm going to start here in Exodus 16, verses 1. We're going to read verses 1 through 3. They've been wandering around, right? And excuse me. They've been wandering around. Pardon me, I had to sneeze there. They've been wandering around, and this is where they get the manna from heaven, and then they eventually get the quail too, right? This is manna from heaven. And they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. So they'd been there for a couple months. Then they complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate the bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Wow, wow, wow. Here's a kind of a complimentary verse here in Numbers 11, as we'll read verses 1 through 5. All right, this is the people complain. This is the little heading in the Bible. The first one was the people complain. This one, the people complain. Now, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. So he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. Now, the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There was nothing at all except this manna before our eyes." So before they were complaining that they didn't got nothing to eat, and now they're complaining because they don't like what they got to eat. Right? And notice how they says this. "We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt." You were slaves in Egypt. You were under awful hardship physically, but yet you think you just ate freely in Egypt? So they're looking back on something that happened not long before, and they're looking back on it fondly. This instead of saying, "Look, we're in the will of God. It may look bleak when we look around right now, but we keep trusting in God. We keep following in God. Things will get better, whether in this life or in eternity. Things will get better because we know we are following in God's desire for our lives." Right now. This happens all the time. I do this. We all do this. I can relate it back to when I think about, for instance, when I think about high school football, right? Like I've mentioned on this podcast before, I excelled at being an average football player. I was great at that. And so I went to a tiny school, right? We played 8-man football, didn't even have enough people to have a football team like you see on TV, right? They have 11 people on each side. Played 8-man football, and we were average or below average team every single year that I played. Now, when I look back on that, we had a thing called, some of you, if you've played football or whatever, you remember this stuff, two-a-days, right? Right before, a few weeks before school started, when it was blazing hot in the Oklahoma summer, we would have two-a-days where you would go in and you would have these practices twice a day in 100-degree weather, right? And I remember several times during two-a-days and even during the first part of the school year, you would say, okay, it's 115 degrees out. Surely coach is going to cancel practice today. They never did. All they did was say, be sure and take an extra water break. And that water break was about, what is that? Where's that? Where the rapture is described? Will be transformed in the twinkling of an eye. The twinkling of an eye is how long that water break, the extra water break, lasted, right? And it wasn't anything special by any means. And but when you look back on something like my high school football career, for instance, I don't think about the two-a-day practices and the awful heat and the pain and the suffering. What I look back on is the highlights, right? The highlights is what I'm focused on. I'm not looking at all that drudging work and drudging horrible, painful, excruciating stuff he had to do during that time. I'm looking at the highlights. And that's what we tend to do. We tend to look back on our lives, even during awful periods, and tend to look fondly back on things. And I'm going to expand on that here in a minute. Now, another thing is, when I look back on, I had a 20 year career in oil refining, right? Where you take crude oils, you make gasoline, diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, whatever. You make all that stuff, right? That's what I did for 20 years. I was an operator, and then I was like a supervisor for a few years at the end. However, when I look back on that was rotating shift work, right? It was, and not to mention it was very high stress job. Not all the time, but when it was high stress, it was super high stress, and it was a high stress job. And you were physically and mentally exhausted because you were in a constant state of fatigue, right? A constant state of fatigue, because this will make no sense to most people in the world. There's going to be a handful of you where it does make sense. So schedule was you work 12-hour shifts, right? So you'd work 12-hour shifts, daylight. So you're like, we're talking 5 to 5 around that time period, right? So 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. You'd work that for 4 days. Then you'd get 7 days off, and that was the perk of it. And then you'd come back and you work 4 nights in a row. That's 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. Work that in a row. You'd be off for a few days, and then you'd work three days, like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then you were off one day, and you come back on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night. So you work 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. And then you come back the following Monday. See, it makes no sense whatsoever to anybody, because it doesn't. It doesn't make any sense. It's like somebody said, how can we screw up the body physically and mentally and mess up your circadian rhythms and your sleep patterns to where you have no sense of what day it is, or up or down or left or right. And they said, that's what we're going to go with. We're going with that schedule. I did that for 20 years, right? Did that for 20 years. And you don't realize when you're in it how awful it is until you're outside of it. Then you can look back. But the thing is, I look back on my 20-year refining career, and I tend to look at the highlights, at the relationships and the good times and the fun times that we had, right? I know I have knowledge of the awfulness that it was, but I also tend to look back fondly, right? So that's what we tend to do with our sin nature, right? Too. So listen to this. This is Luke 9, verses 23 through 27. He's talking to the disciples here. Then he said to them all, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Take up his cross daily, follow me. In other words, die to yourself daily. Whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what profit a man if he gains the whole world and is himself destroyed or lost? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes on his own glory and in his Father's day and in the holy angels. But I tell you truly, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the kingdom of God. And what he's talking about there is, think about it, when you're saved, you are a different person. Think about the image of being baptized, right? You're buried, you're dead, buried, resurrected, completely new. New creation, new creature. That's how you're described all the time. New birth, right? New beginning. New. What did you do with your old self? What did you do with all your old sin nature, your old sin activities that you used to indulge in before you knew better and accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior? Before you had the scales that fell from your eyes, you used to indulge in all sorts of debauchery that you didn't even realize how bad it was. And now you know how awful it was and how much you were disobeying God by doing that and displeasing God. And so what did you do to that? That person died and was buried. That person is dead. But yet we tend to look back on it. I do it all the time. I've mentioned before, I'll hear a song on the radio, and that song will be a song that was popular from high school or college before I was saved, right? And I'll hear just the beat come on, and I automatically remember all the words. I mean, if you don't think music has an effect on you, I can remember all the words from a song I haven't heard in 25 years. That's just the truth. And that song, and you'll be like, oh, you'll automatically have good feelings and good thoughts because it takes you back to that good, what you think your brain remembers as a good time, right? And then you listen to that song, it's like, that song was awful. Not to mention the fact that it's reminding you of a time of before you were even saved, before a time where if you would have died during that time, you would have been destined for hell. And that's not a good time to remember. That's not a highlight that you should want to remember. It happens though, right? It's the way our brain works, the way our mind works. But it happens all the time. Think about, you'll see somebody, or even somebody will be telling a story. I'll overhear a story sometimes of, oh, we went and did this. Oh, we got drunk and we had a good time and it was so much fun. And I'll think back to times before I was saved when I would get drunk and do stupid stuff. And the temptation is to look back on that fondly and laugh about how crazy it was, when the reality is that it was just awful. It was sinful. It was debauchery. It was whatever other word you want to describe it as. It's not good, right? And that's what we tend to do a lot of the times. We tend to look back fondly and be drawn back into that, when the reality is, just like they said there, man. They said, we remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions. They were saying, look at this spread that we got every day, man. We didn't have to, we didn't have to want for food. We didn't have to want for water. We didn't have to want for a place to stay. All we had to do was just get whipped every day and tread and make bricks in the burning sun. They leaving that part out. They're cherry picking, if you will, the highlights, right? And they're remembering fondly on that because they're in a place where they're not happy. They're grumbling. And when we get to places like that, like look at our culture around us, when it seems like everybody is turning away from God and the world is getting darker and darker and darker, then it's easy to say, man, maybe I should just fall in. Maybe I should just go back in the fold and just live my old life and just do what I want. Because what's the point, right? It's not like I'm getting ahead. It's not like I'm. What's the point of all this? Well, when that temptation's there, you are acting just like, and I'm telling you, like I said, I do it too. You sit there and you start thinking about the good old days, right? And now there's good old days, and then there's things that you shouldn't be reminiscing about fondly about your old life prior to Christ. And that's the temptation. You start desiring that. And if you start thinking about that long enough, then you will, and man, where it really shows and rears its head is when you face challenges. You face challenges now, and you think about how good it was then when I was not a Christian and wasn't convicted to speak up against debauchery and speak up against deviance and against sin, right? When I wasn't convicted, how much better was life? Ignorance is bliss, right? Ignorance is bliss. Well, it's not bliss. It's not bliss. That'll send you straight to hell is where that ignorance will. That's why we've got to point it out. You got to say the truth in love, which means you got to say the truth. You can't say the truth in love if you don't say the truth. So we live in a world where we have to say the truth. We have to try to guide people to Christ. We have to do that. We are all called to do that. If you say, well, I don't know my calling, well, just look in there. You're called to do that. You're called to witness. You're called to live your life accordingly so your life can be a witness to people around you. And so that's what, but we sit there and we think, well, if we just go back to the way things, we'll just turn back the clock. Especially, look, ever since the COVID junk that happened, I mean, it's sent everybody, the whole world's in a tailspin. Nobody knows what's right or wrong. Remember during that whole time, it's craziness. Like just the other day, I told my wife, I said, I got a big old, I think she ordered it actually, a big old thing of toilet paper. It was just coming in the mail, I'm sitting on the front porch. And I said, I picked that up. I said, remember when everybody was going crazy over this in the store? You couldn't find this anywhere. And everybody was fights over it. People were going nuts over it. Well, that's the crazy world we live in. And people, ever since then, especially since then, everybody's been saying, if we could just get back to normal, guess what? Normal ain't coming back. It's not. The powers that be are dead set that normal does not come back. Because if they can keep you on your heels, then guess what? You looking to them for guidance, they're going to send you every which direction. You're going to be chasing your tail before it's all over with. And you're going to be looking to them, and they're going to send you in the wrong direction. That's the reality. They're going to send you off. They're going to send you down the broad path. That's a Matthew 7, 13, and 14 reference. They're going to send you on the broad path of destruction instead of on the narrow path of life. Right? That's where you're going to end up on the broad path. And the powers that be, I say that, but a lot of times that's the preachers in the pulpit too. They're leading people down that path. They're just preaching this milquetoast gospel that's not convicting at all, and people think they can just show up, check the box, and then they don't have to do anything different. They can, there's this whole thing now. I've seen it, man. It's like it's a, I don't know if you want to call it it's like a cancer that's metastasizing in the church. This whole come as you are, and they stop there. We accept everybody who they are to come. Well, that's fine. Come as you are, but you better leave changed. You better leave convicted. You better leave changed. If you're not changed this time, maybe you'll get changed next time, but you better leave convicted about your sin nature and wanting to change. That's what you need to be doing. And but so often they've got us sitting here where it feels like some sort of weird game of whack-a-mole where everybody's afraid to stick their neck up too far because they're going to get smashed by the powers that be, by the cancel culture, by the alphabet mafia, by whoever is going to come after you, and you're going to get banned on Facebook. You're going to get whatever, I don't know, a slap on the wrist by somebody. Well, guess what? I'm not looking to get a crown. Where was it? Is it James? It says, no, I don't remember where it is. Anyway, Paul says, I've finished the race, right? And maybe it is James. That's where he talks about, we don't look for this crown, which is like it's made out of like pine and parsley and those, like think of like the Little Caesars guy with the little little crown deal. They used to give those to Olympians, right? That was perish. It will perish. That stuff does not last long. That crown that those people get, well, that's great. Okay, well, what are you going to do in a few days when that's all shriveled up and dead, and somebody knocks it off the shelf and it just turns to a pile of dust, right? It doesn't last. We're looking for a permanent crown, a permanent reward. That's what we're looking for. And all this world offers is that temporary crown. They're giving those out left and right. You can look at these award shows that nobody watches now. You can look all over the place. Everybody's patting themselves on the back. You can look at all these medals and all this stuff. It's just meaningless. The more you realize and take a step back objectively and say, is this good or is this not? Is this temporary or eternal? You start looking at that juxtaposition there, you're going to realize that everything that the world offers you is temporary. But what are you going to do when it's time to punch out, right? To go back to my refinery days. What are you going to do when it's time to punch out, when your ticket is punched and this day life is over and the sun sets on your life and you step into eternity? Are you going to wish that you had went for that crown of glory, that permanent crown, or are you going to wish that you're going to be so happy and look back fondly and say, look what I did. Look at this crown made out of parsley and whatever. I don't think it's part of the olive branches or whatever it's made out of. That's not going to last worth nothing. It's just going to be burned up in the fire with your soul if that's the way you go. So focus on, don't look back fondly on your life, on your sin life that you were. I mean, it's okay to look back and say, well, this has helped get me to where I was. But there's one thing to do that, and there's another thing to be Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite that's going to sit there and always be obsessed, looking back, say, oh, look how great I was here. I see it all the time. There's people that are my age spending every night in the club. Right? Spending every night in the club thinking that they're right back. They never left high school or they never left college. They're right back in that hole. They've never left that. That's their whole culture. You got to get past that. You got to die to self. You've got to follow Christ, take up your cross daily, so that the Jesus will not be ashamed of you whenever you see him face to face.